the church for 1800 years being engaged in war, and that if the church and popes and bishops and saints all justified this, then how can it not be so? And maybe a little bit of history would be helpful here. I mean, first of all, there is something to be said for recognizing that before there were the Gospels, before there was the New Testament, there was tradition, capital T. That is, there was the holy tradition, the tradition that clearly, accurately held and stated the will of God that Jesus taught for our salvation, and who Jesus was and what he was. And that tradition, which predates the Gospels and the Epistles, that tradition is authentically presented in the New Testament. And within the New Testament, the most authentic, the part of that tradition that has special preeminence, at least in the Catholic Church, is the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You can check that out in Vatican II's Dogmatic Constitution of Revelation, section 18. But be that as it may, tradition precedes the Gospels. Therefore, what we have to say is that the Gospels are not contradictory to tradition. They are an extension of not even an extension, they are a presentation of the tradition. Now, after the Gospels, we have the epistles, not necessarily in chronological order, but what we have pretty much closing at the end of the first century is we have the 27 books that we call the New Testament. Now, admittedly and truthfully, they were not formally designated as the New Testament as a unit until about 363, first by St. Athanasius, I believe, and then 420 at a council. But those documents, what they were presenting was the original tradition of the church. And therefore, it becomes important to recognize that the church's teaching is that revelation ends with the close of the New Testament. There's no new public revelation. There may be private revelations, but there is no new public revelation. This is it. This is what we have to work with. And so in early Christianity, starting with the original tradition that precedes the Gospels, going into the Gospels, and for a time after the Gospels, Christianity was nonviolent and taught a way of nonviolent love of friends and enemies as consistent with what Jesus taught and what his presentation of the will and the way of the Father was. The original tradition of Christianity that was expanded upon, it was originally expanded upon, is Jesus being nonviolent and teaching a way of nonviolent love of friends and enemies. Indeed, even as late as 215, we have the apostolic tradition of Hippolytus, which is, or Hippolytus, which is a really formal document in the church that has that lets us know what the church was thinking at that time, at least the Church of Rome. And it says to the catechumen, if you're in the military and you want to become a catechumen, you have to tell them you will not kill anymore. If they won't accept that, you got to get out of the military. And it says, if you're not in the military, you may not join. This is 215. And then we have such fathers of the church saying when Christ disarmed Peter, he disarmed all Christians and so forth. But clearly at the point that you have some of the fathers of the church having to argue strongly for the nonviolence of Jesus and the lack of violence and the lack of enmity in his teaching, obviously something is going on in culture that they're worried about the church, and people are thinking that perhaps they can kill and they can hate and they can maim and they can whatever you do in war and still be following Jesus. Something is going on that they're responding to. As for example, in Syria, on the Eucharist, there was Eucharist being celebrated in the 2nd century with semen and females' eggs. Now, just because Christians did something did not mean that the church accepted it. And so what we have is, we have basically, for the first 3 centuries, there is not a single document that we know of, written document, theological document, spiritual document, that justifies violence and war, and Christians participating in them, in violence and war or capital punishment. Just abortion. It's not there. There is no writing that justifies that. Not one in 300 years. That's longer than the United States has been in existence. Now, that's the 300 years closest to Jesus. That's when the Gospels and the epistles were written in Greek, which was the language of the empire at the time. That's when they were understood in their native language, Koine Greek. No translations involved and so forth and so on. And that's a pretty incredible witness. Nothing like it in the history of the world, as a matter of fact. But things began to deteriorate. Christians began to accumulate wealth. They began to cozy up to politicians and on and on. And Roman emperors saw that this was a problem. Roman emperors saw that this was a problem. And so on at least 3 occasions, they went about the business of executing a final solution for Christianity in the Roman Empire. The last of them was Diocletian. It didn't work, as a matter of fact. What happened was that, to use the phrase of Tertullian, the blood of martyrs became the seed of Christianity. And all that attacking of Christianity, the murders, the rapes, the robberies, the throwing of families into the Circus Maximus, burning them to death, being eaten by lions, there is not a single document where a Christian writes, a Christian spiritual writer writes, a father of the church writes, that a Christian can kill the Roman soldier that comes to get him, or his family, or anything else. It just isn't there. That's the history of Christianity till approximately 313. I raise it because the Christianity we know, the only Christianity we ever come in contact with, is the Christianity from about 313 on forward. A Christianity of Christians being engaged in, but here's the big point, justifying their engagement in. Remember, Christians committed adultery in the first 300 years. It's just that the church didn't justify it. Christians killed in the first 300 years. It's that the church didn't justify it. It's the church's justification of this as the teaching of Jesus that's the critical aspect of things. And so, until approximately the 4th century, Christianity follows its Savior, and teaches a way of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, and understands this has implications in terms of going in the military, going in the government, jobs they took, and so forth and so on. And they did this not as an intellectual exercise, but they lived this way. They lived it under serious persecution. Because for the first 300 years, Christianity was an outlaw religion in the empire. It was illegal. So this is not something that was just there as an academic statement. This was something that was so deep-rooted in Christianity that even in the face of awesome, terrible persecution, the church held to it. Did all Christians hold to it? Obviously not, but the church held to it.